So for like 15 years, I have focused a tremendous amount of my time and energy and thought on how to make this game easier to run, how to make role-playing games in general easier to run. But obviously, I've had a big focus on 4th edition back in the 2010s to 2014s, and now with 5th edition D&D, but now all of the variants of 5th edition from 2014 until today. And it's very easy to focus on kind of big philosophy, like what are the main drivers of how to be a great GM? What are the things that you can do to be a great GM? I've talked a lot about this. I've written about it in Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master and the Companion in the Workbook and Forge of Foes and other books. I've written about it on Sly Flourish, where I have articles like the top tips for dungeon masters. These, I would argue, are bigger philosophies to keep in mind to help you run your game, like letting the story unfold at the table. Don't come with a preconceived notion where it's going to go. Set up situations and let them navigate the situations. Be on the character's side. Be a fan of the characters and their heroes. Use the tools and techniques that help you prepare to improvise rather than hardening your whole thing. And focusing on your next game, making sure that you're not getting too wound up in your bigger campaign, but you're really just kind of focusing on the things that you need for the next game you're going to run. Building from the characters outwards, paying attention to pacing, focusing on the fiction first and the mechanics second, and always evolving your own style as the hobby continues to evolve with it. Those are like big philosophies. I will link to that. The top tips for dungeon masters, I will link to that in the show notes so that you can take a look at it. But today, I want to talk about something a little different. Today, I want to focus on small, tactical, dirty tricks. Yes, all of those big philosophies are really important. And I firmly believe that if you read and understand and kind of take those philosophies to heart, those are not just mine. These are philosophies I've heard from many, many GMs, and many people have confirmed that those are really great ways to approach this hobby. Those are big philosophies. Today, I want to focus on dirty tricks specific to 5th edition. So specific to 5e, D&D 20, probably D&D 2024, Tales of the Valiant, Level Up Advanced 5e, and others. These are dirty tricks that you can do that make your game just easier to run. Real specific things. Starting off with, an example is using the Forge of Foes monster stats. So in Forge of Foes, we have a table in there called Monster Stats per Challenge Rating. We like this so much that we actually made it available under a Creative Commons attribution license, and it's available on a system reference document. And in it, we have a table in here that you can use to build basic statistics for a monster from challenge rating 0 to challenge rating 30. We also have a bunch of sort of quick use stat blocks of different challenge ratings: CR1 8, CR1 half, CR2, CR4, CR7, CR11, and CR15. We picked those very particular stats, those particular challenge ratings, because those monsters are the most flexible kinds of monsters you can run at different challenge ratings. And the reality is, for a lot of monsters, you don't need much more than the core stats. That when you use the core stats and you use your own description and flavor, you can build a monster that players are not going to recognize or really any different from any other kind of monster. This is like the dirty trick of like just use the bear stat block, which has been around forever. That idea of like when you're hard up for a monster and you don't have one, grab the bear stat block and go with it. I heard it recently of like in Knave 2.0, they said use the owlbear stat block. The owlbear stat block is a great generic stat block that you can throw in because it kind of hits that perfect challenge rating or that perfect level, the perfect amount of challenge for the characters, and you can just use that and then reskin it into whatever kind of monster you want. Well, the truth is that when you have a table like this where you can pick any challenge rating out and you have your core stats for that challenge rating, you really don't need a lot else. You can improvise a lot else. You can give them like just from your head one little technique, one little tactic that changes them slightly so that they feel different on the table. And you can, of course, flavor them with your own narrative, your own description of what they're like in incredible ways to make all of these monsters unique. Since we started developing Forge of Foes, which was probably a year and a half ago, I've started using these stats, replacing typical monsters with stats like this, and nobody can tell the difference. I've asked my players, I've been very clear with them, like, hey, how did that monster feel? Was that fun? Did you like it? And like, yeah, no, it was great. I'm like, did it feel different than monsters you fought in the past? Yeah, no, it was fun. Like, I really liked it. And no, it didn't feel weaker or stronger, and it didn't feel broken or anything like that. They didn't care, right? Because it really doesn't matter. They want to see their characters do cool stuff. When a monster does a cool thing, they take notice. But they don't need all the monsters to do it. Now, of course, you're going to jump to like, hey, I'm not going to run my Lich or my version of Orcus or my big archmage boss this way. No, I don't expect you to make big, meaningful characters using this. but almost every other monster can be done. You can have small minions, you can have large brutes, basically anything outside of named monsters, anything outside of like really big named monsters. You generally don't need more than just a basic stat block to do so. And you can get that right off of here. Patrons have access to the Forge of Foes stat generator, which gives you like a nice card for stats. And of course, Forge of Foes itself have the stats in there. So try that out. But that to me was like a recent tip. This is something, the reason I put this at the top is it's something I've been doing recently. And man, it's making the whole game easier. Use static monster damage to subtract 3 and add 1d6. I've been using static monster damage forever. Static monster damage is actually the default for 5e. 5e monster stats all use static monster damage and then have a die roll next to it. I think actually Tales of the Valiant tried to make it the only version, and enough people complained that they added the dice equations back in. So definitely DMs like rolling their dice for monster stats. But I'll tell you, if you want to make your life a little easier, use static monster damage instead of using the dice equation for when you have a lot of monsters. If you have only one monster and you want to roll dice, go with the gods. But generally speaking, you can use static monster damage and no one is going to be the wiser. If you want to add some variance, the most common complaint is, yeah, but then everybody knows that it does 13 damage every time it hits, every single time. If you want to add some variance, a very easy trick, this came from Chris Perkins originally, is where I heard it from, is take whatever the static number is, subtract 3 from it, and then roll 1d6. And you can do that for any amount. If the creature does 16 damage, instead it's 1d6 plus 13. If the monster does 27 points of damage, it's 24 plus 1d6. You just subtract 1d6 and subtract 3 from the static damage, add and then roll a die. And that gives just enough variance that players can't really keep track of exactly what they're doing. They won't even know that you're doing it. And it works really well. Super fast, super easy, super dirty trick for making monsters faster and easier to run. Use static monster damage either directly or subtract 3 and add 1d6 to the static damage amount. Big question, what do you do for crits? Just double the crit. Don't worry about it. Double it. Double the damage. They'll be fine. Don't get all bent out of shape. But, you got to roll the dice. If you really want to be particular, you use the maximum, you use the static damage and then roll the dice equation on top of it. But honestly, just double it. It's fine. Have the monsters go on initiative 12. So this is really interesting. I think we've only seen one stat block for monsters from the 2024 version of D&D, but it looks like they are going to be including a passive initiative score. And that's one I wasn't really crazy about the stat block, but I really like that idea because I've been using static initiative a lot, and it's fantastic for a whole bunch of reasons. And this to me is the thing about really great dirty tricks. Really great dirty tricks are ones that give you multiple benefits for one switch. And this is a multiple benefit for one switch sort of issue, because not only is it faster and easier for you to do initiative by just saying that the monsters either use their static initiative bonus, or I just say 12. Just give them monster 12. And then you might lower it for things like slimes where you know that they're low, or zombies. But generally speaking, just say 12. When you pick initiative 12, it means that almost always some players are going to go before it and some players are going to go after it. You don't get this super swingy initiative where the monsters roll a 1 and now all of the players get to attack the monster before it ever gets a chance to go. And likewise, you don't get a situation where the monster goes before everybody else does, or maybe all of the monsters go and you weren't ready for all of those monsters to go before the characters even made their way into the room. So when you are able to split the characters up so that some of them go before the monsters do and some of them go after, you actually get a far better pacing for your combat. And the easiest way to do that is to just say the monsters go on 12. That way they're right in the middle. Probably you can have some every so often you'll have it where the players will roll all lower than that or all above it. That's really rare. Most of the time you're going to have some characters before it, some characters after it, and it works really well. So, and it's super fast because you don't have to roll initiative for the monsters anymore. Monsters go on 12. My players are so used to this that they just know it and they just go on 12. So it works. Static goes really fine. Another little side dirty trick on this one is if you really want a fast battle, just go around the table. Shadow Dark does this. You can basically have everybody roll for initiative. Whoever rolled the highest, they start first, and it goes around the table with the GM. When it gets to the GM, that's when the monsters go. Works very well for Shadow Dark and can work well for everything else. Tell players what's going on. This is a little bit more of a philosophy than it is like the deep, dirty trick. But a lot of times you're finding it frustrating to try to explain to characters what's going on inside the world. Sometimes you need to just break out and just tell them what's going on. This is a really good way to use like pause for a minute. When it's kind of clear that the players, aren't understanding exactly what the situation is. They're acting in really weird ways. They're doing things that their characters wouldn't do. That's a good time to just tell the players what's happening. Just stop for a second and say, here's what's going on, just so you're aware. And they'll go, I didn't get it. Because players are only understanding about half of what you're saying at any given time. Players are only understanding about half of what you're describing. And so sometimes you're going to need to do other things. And one way to do it is break character and talk to them as players. Super valuable trick. Talk to your players as players. Break character, talk to your players as players. It's a great way to get everybody on board. Great way to like break away from things like, well, that's what my character would do, or I don't trust that other character because of X, Y, or Z. You can break out and say, you can trust that character because they are played by your friend Bob, who's sitting right over there, right? Tell players what's going on. Use the pause for a minute idea. I use it as my own verbal X card. Hey, pause for a minute. Let's make sure that we're doing X, Y, or Z, or that we're avoiding this kind of thing and whatever, and jump in. Talk to your players. Use the luck system from Tales of the Valiant. When the Black Flag SRD first came out and it had the luck system in there, I looked at it and I was like, wow, this is really good. And now I have used it in multiple different 5e games and I love it. The luck system is fantastic. The way the luck system works is it replaces inspiration. So instead of the inspiration mechanic that any other version of 5e has, you instead have the luck system. The way the luck system works is that characters can earn a luck point every time they fail a saving throw or an attack roll. So anytime they fail an attack roll or saving throw, they gain a luck point. They can expend a luck point to add +1 onto any d20 check. So it could be a skill check, it could be a saving throw, it could be an attack bonus. They can add a 1 to it. And if they have multiple luck points, they can add multiple points to add 2, 3, or so on. They can also expend 3 luck points to re-roll a roll, basically giving themselves advantage on a check by expending 3 luck points to do that. They can only hold up to 5 luck points, and if they get a 6th luck point, they instead roll 1d4, and that's how many luck points they have. That way, they're not going to hoard them. It's really fast and flexible. It seems more complicated than inspiration, but the great part about it is it's completely on the player side. It gives them a value for loss, so when you have players who are just unlucky and they're rolling really poorly, every time they're having one of their poor rolls, they're getting a new luck point, and then they can expend those to improve their luck. It works really, really well. It's a system that the GM doesn't have to manage, which I love, and it gives players a good incentive and shakes up the pacing for the game. Again, lots of different elements of value for one trick. Reveal the heroic spark. So this is one that I talked about a little bit in the pause for a minute, that whenever you're introducing a new character to a group, you can stop and describe them and say, in their eye, you see the heroic spark, knowing that this is another companion who you can trust along with the rest of your adventurers. You're bypassing all of the need for building trust among the characters, because that can get really tedious and boring in a high fantasy role-playing game. There are obviously games where that sort of suspicion is part of the gameplay. But I think a lot of times in our high heroic fantasy dungeon delving sort of games, the idea of not trusting a new character who came in is such a chore, and then spending the time and energy to get the characters to start to trust each other may make for really great character bonding, but could also take a lot of time that you don't really want to take. So instead, you can just say, when you look into the eye of this character, you can see the heroic spark and recognize that they're on the same drive to, that they're a companion to be trusted. And it works really well. And you'll even have some players like, oh, I don't know. And you're like, no, you do. All right. This one is one where you railroad them. Your character can tell by looking at this character that they are a companion who can be trusted. Now, of course, it's really important that they can be trusted. Don't let a character betray the other characters, right? And again, unless you're playing that kind of game and everybody's aware of it ahead of time, I would not have a player. I've done it. I made the mistake. I broke trust with players. It was really bad. Don't do it. Reusing secrets and clues. I talked about this recently, and this is kind of a new trick. And in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, I suggested that you write down 10 new secrets and clues every time you're doing your prep. Then I realized when I'm doing my prep, a lot of time I'm stealing old secrets and clues from old sessions. And that turns out that's a really good lazy trick. So I no longer say that you have to rewrite all of your 10 secrets and clues. You should review all of the secrets and clues you're going to use, but you can certainly go back over old notes, find secrets and clues that are still relevant, that are still useful, and move those forward so you don't have to come up with 10 brand new ones every single time. A little bit of a change in how I've done Return, but it works really well. I have a whole bunch of different ability check tricks that I'm going to pile into one. We're going to do these really fast. So 1, keep 3 DCs in your head, 10, 15, and 20. As the Dungeon Master's Guide describes, if you only have those 3 numbers, you can run your whole game. 10 for relatively easy or normal checks, 15 for a little bit harder, and 20 for more advanced checks. Those 3 numbers can get you really far. 10 for normal, 5 for hard, 20 for really hard checks. Default to 10 most of the time. Most of the time, for most of the things that you would want to do, default to 10. Even though your characters are going to succeed at those very often, succeeding is cool, succeeding is fun, and only if there's a good reason why it should be DC 15 or DC 20, keep it at DC 10, and it works really well. Second, you can always roll with a floor. So one of the things you can do is say, we know that in order for the game to go forward, they're going to have to open this door, but we want to see how well they open the door. So you could say, like, I want you to roll a check to open the door. Like, say it's a Thieves' Tools check. You know they're going to succeed, but do they break a pick? Do they make some noise? Is there something else on there? So you can have a low floor that says, basically, they're going to succeed at this, but how well do they succeed? So that's adding a little bit of an analog component to the DC check. It works really well. And third, there are times where you could just have everybody roll, and whoever rolls the highest, they're the one that either succeeds on the check or learns the thing or something like that. That way you're not gatekeeping an entire thing behind ensuring that somebody has to succeed. You know somebody's going to succeed. The big question is who's going to do it. Go ahead and roll, have everybody roll, and then whoever rolled the highest, they're the one that figured the thing out. So those are just a couple of ways to use ability checks that are kind of outside the norm but work really well. Use movable keys and cut from the boring middle. Again, this is sort of 2 tricks tied into one. A movable key is essentially whatever the MacGuffin is that's required for the characters to complete a quest in an exploration area or like a dungeon or something like that. You can change the pacing by moving that key closer or further away from the characters. I know you're violating some kind of principle that the world is a real place and that the thing is the way it is. We're all sitting around a table trying to have fun. Sometimes things are getting really tiresome. If you want, you can just move the key to a closer room. You can shut off hallways and branches and other chambers, move the key closer or move the key further away if things are happening a little too quickly. So movable keys are a big one. This is something that the Cypher system talks about. Monty Cook Games has talked about this in the Cypher system. And I think it's a really good trick. Another one is to cut from the boring middle. If you are time constrained in your adventure and you want to make sure that you're staying to the fun, look at the parts, look at the filler in the middle. Don't cut the ending out. This is something I see a lot in organized play games that are on a time limit, is they will run the adventure all the way up to the end and then say, sorry, we don't have time for the conclusion. We're just going to call it right here. Nothing is worse. Very little is worse than that. There's definitely things that are worse than that, but that's pretty bad. Better is cut from the middle. Know how much time you're going to need for the end and keep cutting from the middle until you can get to that end. So usually there's a lot of stuff in the middle that's really not nearly as interesting as the stuff that happens at the beginning or ending. So cut from the middle. Assigning player roles. This is actually kind of an OSR sort of idea. It's something I'm getting more used to, is delegating certain activities to the players for the game. And one example that I've been talking about for a long time, I talk about this in Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master, is who is going to manage initiative. You don't have to manage initiative. Somebody else can do it. So you can say like, hey, who wants to do initiative today? You're now the initiative tracker. But there's other roles too. Who's the cartographer? Who's going to draw a map for the rest of the group to keep track of where you are in a dungeon? Who's going to keep track of the loot that you acquire and how that loot was distributed? A quartermaster sort of role. Who's going to be who's going to be writing up notes and sharing those notes so that other players can keep track of what happened in the game, and then the next session's game, everybody can review those notes and see what happened. Who's going to be that? The Dolmenwood RPG from the creators of Old School Essentials had another role that they put in there, which I think is kind of an old role, an old idea, but kind of refreshed, called the Caller. The Caller is the person of the group who is going to make the final decision that they give to the GM. Who's going to be the one to get input from the other players, to get input from the other characters, but come to a conclusion about where you're going to go. I've only tried this in one session so far. I'm going to try it again and see how it goes. But the idea of basically delegating away the need for consensus to one of the players rather than the GM is another thing that we might be able to get off of our plate. I think that's going to be very group dependent. I think that some groups that can work well, I think some groups that might not work well. You might have some people who are just loud and obnoxious who are going to hate it when they're not the Caller, or they're going to dominate the group if they are the Caller. And sometimes it takes a GM to manage that rather than one of the players to manage it, because the players haven't necessarily signed up to manage that sort of working with those different behaviors. So Caller, I think, is a little harder than those other roles, but it's something I definitely want to try out. So those are my 10 dirty tricks for running 5e games. I'm sure you have your own dirty tricks. I would love to hear them. Put them in the comments. Tell me about your dirty tricks, things that just make it easier for you to run this game. Something where you're like, wow, it's so much faster. It's so much easier. I'm so much happier with the game now that I don't have to do this thing, or that I've passed off this thing, or I've simplified this thing. And keep your own list. Keep your own list of your own dirty tricks. Try them out. Try them out in your game. See which ones work for you. See which ones don't. And come up with your own list and continually refine it to make running your 5e game even easier as possible so you can focus on the fun parts.